When he was 18 years old, Karol Wojtyła first made his own personal consecration to Jesus through Mary after reading the book True Devotion to Mary by St. Louis de Montfort. He later described that Marian consecration as a decisive turning point in his life. In fact, he placed his consecration at the very heart of his personal spirituality, renewing it every day. Now, perhaps the fact that he had lost his biological mother at a young age contributed to the fervor with which he lived out this crowning of Marian devotion. But whatever the reason, his consecration touched him deeply, and he explicitly chose the Mother of God as his own adoptive mother, entrusting himself to her motherly care. In fact, here's one of the prayers of consecration he often prayed. I belong totally to you, and all that I have is yours. I take you for my all. O Mary, give me your heart. Now, when Wojtyła became a bishop, he adopted a shortened version of this particular prayer to Mary as his episcopal motto. Specifically, it was totus tuus, meaning totally yours, which appeared below his episcopal coat of arms. Now, that coat of arms, which consisted of a golden cross with the letter M on the lower right, it also emphasized his personal consecration to his mother Mary. And I say that because that coat of arms captured the iconic moment from the Gospel of John, chapter 19, verses 26 through 27. That's when Jesus, dying on the cross, entrusts his mother to us, behold your mother, and us to his mother, behold your son. Anyway, when Wojtyła became Pope John Paul II, he kept that same episcopal motto and coat of arms. So seeing that Wojtyła had such an extraordinary Marian devotion, it's not surprising that this most Marian pope, as many have called him, would be the first pope in nearly 30 years to renew the effort to consecrate Russia to Mary's Immaculate Heart. But it wasn't easy. Now, to properly understand that story, we should briefly review the beginning of John Paul's pontificate. Now, after his election, Pope John Paul II had divine mercy very much on his mind. In fact, only 2 years after his election, he said, "Right from the beginning of my ministry in St. Peter's See in Rome, I considered this message of divine mercy my special task." Now, such a statement is not so surprising when we recall that he was elected just 6 months after having worked for 10 years to get the ban lifted on the divine mercy message and devotion. And so just as he worked to spread divine mercy in Poland, so now he worked to spread it to the whole world from Rome. For instance, recall that as early as 1980, he published an encyclical letter, Divis in Misericordia. And as we learned in an earlier episode, that was just the beginning of his work as the Great Mercy Pope. However, in 1981, something happened that influenced his whole pastoral strategy. Now, the event I'm referring to is his being shot and nearly killed on the anniversary of the first apparition of Our Lady of Fatima. Okay, so after that event, while recovering from his gunshot wounds, John Paul read the third secret of Fatima and determined that his spiritual mother Mary was more explicitly involved in his mission of mercy than he had at first realized. Specifically, he came to understand that Mary was to play a major role, not just in his own personal history, but in the history of the modern world. And he further realized that God was calling him, the Pope, to help bring her into that role. Now, as strange as it might seem, Mary actually needed John Paul's help to take up that mission. Why? Well, look at it like this. When we make a personal consecration to Jesus through Mary, we're basically inviting Mary to come and get involved in our lives. And because Mary's not an overbearing mother, because she respects human freedom, she waits for such an invitation. But just as people need to choose to consecrate themselves to Mary, so someone has to choose for the whole world to be consecrated to her. And the only one who has the authority to do that is the Pope. Well, because John Paul II clearly understood his authority regarding the consecration of the world, he made such a consecration one of his top priorities. And he began that path to consecrating the world by first renewing his own personal consecration. In fact, less than a week after the assassination attempt, in a recorded address to the pilgrims in St. Peter's Square, John Paul repeated his own personal consecration to Mary, saying, "To you, Mary, I repeat, totus tuus ego sum," meaning, I am totally yours. Then, less than a month later, on June 7, 1981, the solemnity of Pentecost, he prayed the act of consecration of the world and Russia. However, because he was still recovering from his wounds, his prayer had to be recorded and broadcast for the people. Also, few bishops were present, and so this first attempt at the consecration of Russia did not fulfill Our Lady's request at Fatima. Nevertheless, John Paul would soon try again. In fact, exactly 1 year after the assassination attempt, Pope John Paul II made a pilgrimage to Fatima, Portugal, and while there, he tried to get all the bishops to join him for a consecration of the world and Russia. Now, unfortunately, the timing didn't work out and the bishops couldn't participate. So again, Our Lady's request was not fulfilled. Still, that consecration event was deeply significant, especially because John Paul made an explicit connection between divine mercy and Fatima, particularly with regard to Marian consecration. Now, in the last episode, we saw how the Fatima messages themselves allude to such a connection. Just think of the angel's words about designs of mercy, and Sister Lucia's last vision that included the words grace and mercy. But in 1982, John Paul made this connection even more explicit. And he did so during his homily at Fatima, where he described the widespread and almost apocalyptic evil of our time. An evil, he said, that menaces, that is spreading, and that gathers like a dark cloud over mankind. And he even admitted that this evil caused trepidation in his own heart. Now, despite all that, he found hope in what he called a love more powerful than evil, a love that no sin of the world can overcome. And this love he identified as merciful love. And how do we get to that merciful love? How do we learn to accept it and allow it to fill our hearts? Well, according to Pope John Paul II, the merciful love of Christ comes to us especially through our consecration to the Immaculate Heart of Mary. It comes to us through Mary's intercession, which then leads us to the very fountain of life that sprang from Golgotha, what the Pope calls the fountain of mercy, which is the blood and water that flowed from the pierced side of Christ as a source of grace and mercy for us. In fact, the Pope explained that consecration to the Immaculate Heart of Mary means returning to the cross of the Son. It means bringing the world and all its problems and sufferings to the pierced heart of the Savior, and thus back to the very source of its redemption. In other words, it means bringing the world and ourselves through Mary to divine mercy, to the power of merciful love. And who best knows the power of merciful love? According to the Pope, Mary knows it more than any other heart in the whole universe, visible and invisible. And she knows it so intimately because in her Immaculate Conception, she was and is the greatest recipient of God's mercy.